Hi, this is Jennifer Bremer of the League of Women Voters. I'm happy to welcome you to this recording of our July webinar, which talks about the Common Cause v. Lewis court case currently being heard in state court and challenging the state legislative maps. What we're going to be covering today, in the webinar itself, we had some information very kindly provided by Attorney Jacqueline Maftori of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Unfortunately, my attempts to record it while she was doing that were not successful, so I've tried to integrate her points into this. So I'm sorry about that, folks, for those of you listening to the recording who did not hear the webinar. And so we're going to talk about what the case is, why it's important, how we got here, including very briefly on the Covington case and Harris v. Cooper, what arguments are being made in this case and the evidence being presented, as well as what we have learned from the unfortunate, from our perspective, Rucho case before the Supreme Court, and where do we go from here. As I say, we had Jacqueline with us, but unfortunately the recording going back between the webinar and the Uber conference site and the slideshow did not work. So I re-recorded this, but I unfortunately could not call upon Jackie to redo her piece. It didn't seem fair. So what is Common Cause v. Lewis? Well, the plaintiffs are Common Cause and the Democratic Party, plus some individual defendants, and individual plaintiffs. And the defendants are the NCGA leadership as well as the State Board of Elections, and they are challenging the current legislative maps. So unlike Rucho, which challenged the congressional maps in federal court before the Supreme Court, this case challenges the state maps in state court. You can challenge the state maps in federal court, but this case is in state court. And it's challenging them as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander based on the North Carolina Constitution rather than the federal Constitution. And it's currently being heard in state court, specifically in Wake Superior Court, which is where all constitutional cases start out being heard. Just as in the federal system, they go to the federal district court and then are appealed potentially to the circuit court, but usually if they're constitutional to the Supreme Court. The same is true of our state system. They go from the Wake Superior Court to the state Supreme Court if they are appealed. And there are our beloved justices over there, and including Sherry Beasley, the relatively newly appointed Chief Justice in the middle there. And an oddity in this case is that there's something called intervening defendants, which I at least had never heard of. And that means that in addition to the people who were specifically sued, the leadership and the Board of Elections, there also were a number of additional defendants who were brought in by the defendant side, in other words, the legislature, to make their case on behalf of the voters for why they did not feel that what they had done was counter to the Constitution or counter to the interest of the voters and our democracy. So how did we get here? Well, there are two cases that I would cite very briefly. One, Covington v. North Carolina, which was a case that challenged the legislative districts as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders, and that was in federal court as an example, as I say, that you can contest local maps in federal court, and that led to a redrawing of the maps, which was finally completed in June of 2018. And that case then produced the map, which is now being contested as a partisan gerrymander, having been found to be, at least in part, a racial gerrymander. And the other case that's important here is League of Women Voters and Common Cause v. Rucho, which were two cases that were joined together and were heard in federal court and challenged the congressional districts as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. The earlier case had led to a redrawing of the racial gerrymandered up Cooper v. Harris. And it's hard to keep up with all these cases, but these have all been decided. Covington, the League of Women Voters, and Common Cause v. Rucho and Cooper v. Harris have all been decided. Of course, in Rucho, the Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering is outside the capability of federal courts to make a decision, being too political, and is a matter, but could be a matter that would be considered by state courts under state constitutions. They said that it was non-justiciable, meaning the courts can't deal with it. So what evidence and arguments are being presented in the case, or were presented? The case is now wrapped up, although you may still be able to find recordings of it on WRAL under the video link. And they were recording, and they did a really great job of covering the case. and recording all 10 days rather, both morning and afternoon sessions. So the national GOP party officials, it was what's argued in the complaint put in by Common Cause are these points that the national GOP party officials targeted North Carolina for gerrymandering prior to the 2010 election, that Republican mapmakers created the 2011 plans from GOP headquarters, not from they were not drawn by the legislature originally, that the GOP enacted the 2011 plan to entrench themselves in power. In other words, to take power and to in such a way that it's almost impossible to get them out under that map. And the 2011 plans gave Republicans supermajorities grossly disproportionate to the GOP share of the vote. And the federal court struck down many of the districts drawn as racial gerrymanders, and the NCGA then enacted the 2017 plan to dilute the voting power of Democratic voters and to maximize their own political advantage. The criteria that they had adopted stated that political considerations were okay and said that racial data would not be considered. During the redrawing ordered by Covington, the new plan cracked and packed Democrats for extreme partisanship. So here you have an example of some of the evidence that was presented to support these allegations. And you can see that Greenville up there in the northern part and in the middle there that that it was split to create a Democratic district and a safe Republican district in Pitt County. And there's a whole series of these maps that are included in the evidence, and I just presented, just presenting a couple of them. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. This is because you often hear the term country club Republicans, meaning sort of wealthy older people who are Republicans. And this is a kind of an interesting spin on that, in that the Northern District, which was drawn to favor a state representative, the senator rather, I think, it includes the northern part of Wake County and parts of Franklin County. But it also has a little arm that kind of runs down there. You see the arrows pointing to different places where there are in fact 3 different country clubs that are located in this Senate district. There's a lot of quantitative evidence provided. I think this chart is kind of interesting. That they argued that the 27 plans, in fact, were a gerrymander and achieved their goal in the 2018 election, and that partisan gerrymander causes the plaintiffs and Democratic voters to be shut out of the political process. And you can see also that it narrows the range of opinions within each party in the people who are elected, thus shutting out the voters, even if they're, because their representatives are less likely to have an overlap with their views if they're from the other party. And you can see that it shrinks the area of Democratic and GOP overlap there in the middle, as well as on both sides, both Democratic and Republican have become more tightly clustered around their midpoint. They're sort of more pointy there and narrower as you get, rather than being more spread out and covering, a wider range of opinions. A lot of other quantitative evidence was presented based on simulations. This has become really the go-to methodology, despite the attempts from the other side to discredit it and say it was not yet ready for prime time. This has led to, I couldn't say how many academic publications, but numerous academic publications are being published at this point in top journals that are talking about this method, whereby they basically use the computer and standard criteria to simulate a whole bunch of maps. They just tell the computer, okay, compact, contiguous, keep communities whole, and have at it, start drawing maps. And the experts that presented included 3 people that do that, Joey Chen, Jonathan Mattingly, and Wesley Pegden, as well as Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University, who is an expert on the sort of political science side of it. Jonathan Mattingly is the chair of the Duke mathematics department, and Joey Chen and Wesley Pegden are very highly published and recognized experts in this area. This happens to be one of Joey Chen's maps, and it shows the number of split municipalities. So he generated 1,000 maps, and they split some municipalities, but typically they split something like 50 in the middle, or you can see down at the bottom, 50, 54 municipalities in a range of like 48, 44. Up to maybe 61 or something like that. So they definitely split municipalities. You can't you can't really draw the districts. Some of the cities are so big, like Charlotte or what have you, that Raleigh, that you have to split them. They contain more than one district, and there's some that just because of their position you end up splitting them. And of course there are hundreds of municipalities in North Carolina, so you're probably bound to split some of them. Nonetheless, they're pretty tightly clustered there around 52. Whereas over on the right side, you see where the House plan is. None of the 1,000 maps split anywhere near as many municipalities as the House plan, suggesting that although they were supposed to be keeping municipalities whole, that really was not their objective. That they were up to something else. And similarly, they have the same thing. They took their 1,000 maps and they analyzed how they would perform given past election data. So if this precinct went, 80-20 for the Dems, and that precinct went 30-70 for the Republicans, whatever, they use in statewide elections, they use that information to say, well, that's how those precincts are going to perform, and then they see, how many districts would go to each of the candidates, whether that district would go Dem or Republican, basically. Again, you see that there's a distribution, as you would expect, that on the average, the maps gave about 47 seats to the Democrats. This is in the House. And I would point out that 47 is a lot less than 60, which is what you need to get half of the House, 61 to be a majority. So it's not like this is a biased method. This is just what is out there in terms of the geography. But even so, the House plan gives even fewer to the Democrats. It gave only 42. So again, it's completely outside the distribution. You can draw 1,000 maps and never get one as extreme as the House plan. And Mattingly presented very similar, and Pegden presented very similar sets of data. In fact, Pegden actually, due to breaking the units, I think up even smaller than precincts. We have 2,700 precincts, but he generated apparently as many as 1 trillion maps. But we're not going to go there. So indeed, our maps are very rigged. This is a snapshot of a chart that was prepared by Civitas, which is a Republican-leaning or conservative-leaning think tank in Raleigh. And they prepare this thing which they call the Civitas Partisan Index to try to predict, based on that previous data, election data, how different seats are going to perform. And they show across the top that those color categories indicate that the seats below there were designed to go, for example, safe Republican or likely Republican, all the way over to safe Democratic. But the color that's shown there shows how they actually performed in 2018. So there are 100 seats in those two categories on each side, the safe and likely Republican Dem, 58 for the Republicans, 42 for the Dems. And of those 100 seats, only one, it's Christy Clark's district in northern Mecklenburg, went to the Democrats. All of the seats that shifted one way or the other, and you can see that there were, although there were a whole bunch of within that 20, there were a lot of seats that were designed to be at least lean or swing towards the Republicans that went Democrat. And there were also, out of the 3 seats only that were swing or lean for the Democrats, 2 of those actually went to Republicans. So all the action was in those 20 seats, except for that one among the other 100. So in other words, we have 100 seats out of the 120 that are safe for one party or the other. And that's the way the map is designed to perform, and very carefully designed to do so. So the counts alleged as to, what were they really saying that they had violated, that was talking about the facts, were that they had violated the North Carolina Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, which says, and these are direct quotes, that no person shall be denied equal protection of the laws. That it violates the Free Election Clause, which states that all elections shall be free. And this is not in the federal constitution at all. It is in many of the state constitutions, and was important in a recent Pennsylvania case, which led to a redrawing of part of their map. Their constitution also provides a similar protection for free elections. They also allege that the maps violate the freedom of assembly and freedom of speech clauses, and those are in the Constitution. That it states that the people have a right to assemble together, to consult for their common good, to instruct their representatives, and to apply to the General Assembly for redress of grievances. You can recognize some of that is in the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment, but the ours goes beyond that, particularly talking about instructing their representatives, and also provides freedom of speech and of the press are two of the great bulwarks of liberty, and therefore shall never be restrained. So these are very strong protections that we have in our state constitution. So what did we learn from Rucho and other cases that might give an indication of the importance of the common cause case? Well, first, that court cases provide short-term relief only. They throw out a map, but even if they try to establish a general principle, there's very little that would prevent the legislators from either party from just going back and drawing another racial or partisan gerrymander. In fact, partisan gerrymanders were declared to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1987 in the Thornburg case, particularly in North Carolina case. You would expect that that would have caused them to stop drawing partisan gerrymanders around the country, but in fact, it did not. Racial gerrymanders. The racial gerrymanders in the Covington maps, the Covington case maps, in fact, were not fully ruled out by the court until June of 2018. And there's nothing to prevent them from drawing a racial gerrymander in the future and waiting for somebody to sue them. And I would point out that both parties have drawn racial gerrymanders and both parties have certainly drawn partisan gerrymanders. So it's not really a partisan issue. It's an issue of whether the power belongs to the legislators or whether the power belongs to the voters. So even if you do get into court to try to challenge a gerrymander, partisan or racial, it actually takes years to get a decent map, especially in federal court, where you can spend upwards of $250,000 on the case, and it can drag out for several years, which is why we are still, until like a month ago, we were still pursuing, a case from the 2011 redrawing and subsequent maps. So Rucho was a disappointment, but I have to say, and I can say that now that the case has been decided, it probably was not going to be a solution anyway. We need to change the system such that the legislators cannot draw their own maps. That's a conflict of interest, and the only way to change that is not to let them do it and then rely on the courts to try to fix it through a laborious and expensive process, but instead to change the system. So where do we go from here? Well, we continue our strategy of reaching over the heads of the legislators to the key voters, to the voters who are in key districts, and I would say also reaching out to the voters who they are most likely to listen to, which is to say conservative, unaffiliated, and other voters. To work with local leaders that we met in our first round of talks, which were very interesting. We had relatively small attendance. Some of these towns that we were in, although they're the largest towns in the county, they only have 2,000 people, 4,000 people, so you're not going to get a huge crowd. But we had people who were very active locally, very interested, and very supportive. So we're hoping to develop, working with them to develop county committees so that we can understand their perspective and their lay of the land as only they can, and help us to act locally and reach out. We're going to continue working with the Blueprint Coalition, which we've been working with now for over a year, I believe, since it was reformed to start the current cycle, and keep building the Fair Districts NC Coalition. And we had good news in that the NAACP North Carolina state organization joined our coalition, and also recently joining was Church Women United, joining together with a number of other organizations, including NC Churches and the Libertarian Party, Rational Republicans, and of course the League, in trying to work for fair districts. And our aim is to achieve reform, surprise, in time for the next redrawing in 2021. And also, out of this court case, we very well cannot count one's chickens, but we really hope that there will be a new map mandated by the courts for the 2020 election. This could lead to split control in the legislature. And although, as I indicated from the analysis, it may not. It may still lead to a Republican majority, or could lead to a Democratic majority. But the experience shows that if there's split control and neither party is really able to do exactly what it wants, that is the most favorable configuration for redistricting reform. So there were a number of questions, but let me just finish by asking what you can do, asking yourselves to think about what you can do. You can join our statewide team, involved in organizing people and doing things like postcarding, which you can do from home, or other kinds of outreach to voters, tabling at local events, handing out brochures and collecting signatures. Help us to reach out to our voters in our target counties, which I say collecting endorsements, postcarding, making presentations, and helping us organize, and any number of other things which you can do. Help us in doing other promotional events or creating working on our social media. We always need help with our social media and so forth. So I really hope that you will get involved. This is perhaps the most important challenge to our democracy because it determines whether or not our legislators are going to be accountable to the voters. And there is nothing, if you're going to be a representative democracy, then your representatives have to actually be willing to listen to the voters. And that's what this is all about, is whether we can get a system that draws districts in such a way that even though some of them will definitely be Dem and some of them will definitely be R, that there is enough play in the middle district such that the legislators are really under pressure to respond to their voters. So thank you very much, and that's all for now.